Hello and welcome everyone to the February edition of the Open Science Kitchen series. Today we will talk about the benefits and limitations of pre-registration and registered reports. Let's check the agenda. You might ask yourself the question, why exactly this topic? Some of you might have attended already the last Open Science Kitchen event in January where we discussed potential topics. And pre-registration was the first item on the list, so apparently there's some demand for it. It is also a rather new concept and not very common, and for this reason I would like to raise some awareness with this presentation. And in my opinion, this is actually a very nice concept and idea, so let's see how we can work with that. So first of all, I would like to start with the problems which make something like pre-registration and registered reports necessary. Then I will explain a bit what pre-registration actually is and how it can help to solve these problems. However, you will see that pre-registration does not solve all the issues that we have. And for this reason, I will talk a bit about registered reports. And at the end, we will have some time for discussion where you can ask questions. But this event shouldn't feel like a lecture. So I'm also new to the topic of pre-registration and registered reports. And I'm very curious about what you think about this topic. So where do you see the advantages and disadvantages? Do you think this is relevant for your work? Or not at all. And yeah, this is what we can discuss at the end. Before we start with the presentation, I kindly ask you to go to menti.com for a quick survey. Please enter the code and answer the 2 questions, please. So this was the first question, and the second one, please. So these are interesting results, I would say. So most of you have heard already about pre-registration, but most of you have not done it yet. But maybe you have written already a data management plan, or maybe you have asked already for ethical approval before you carried out a study. So please keep that in mind, because you will most likely find a couple of similarities with pre-registration and registered reports. So let's go ahead. Let's start with the problems. So there are a number of questionable research practices. Questionable research practices are practices that are not outright fraud, but also not really right. One such practice is harking, which means hypothesizing after results are known. And one example for harking is switching from explorative research to hypothesis testing. But what does that mean? In explorative research, hypotheses are generated. And in contrast, in hypothesis testing, as the name says, hypotheses are tested. So in explorative research, scientists collect data, they look at the data, and then they formulate hypotheses. In hypothesis testing, researchers define their hypothesis at the beginning and then collect data and analyze it to test the hypothesis. This is not a big problem as long as the researchers report on that like that. It is becoming a problem if researchers generate hypotheses but claim in the paper that the findings have been hypothesized from the start. Another questionable research practice is p-hacking. P-hacking means that researchers tune the data analysis in a way that they achieve significant p-values in situations where it would have been non-significant otherwise. Finally, selective reporting happens if researchers only report on positive results, which is also known as cherry picking. This can result, for example, in underreporting of unexpected or undesirable experimental results. There are also some further drawbacks related to the scientific system. One of them is publication bias. Publication bias means that there is a strong bias towards statistically significant results. It is basically a phenomenon in which studies with positive results are more likely to be published than studies with negative results. This is very similar to p-hacking or selective reporting, but publication bias is coming more from the publication side. So it's either the publishers themselves who want to have positive results, it's either the editors or the reviewers. It is also a problem that researchers receive the most important feedback, so the feedback from the reviewers, very late in the research process, so at the end. So these are quite a few issues, right? And the way I just presented them might suggest that these problems are intentional. So the evil researcher who only cares about his or her career and not at all about truth seeking. But I would rather assume that these practices happen rather unintentionally. For example, because of wrong or missing education, because of wrong or uncritical research standards in the research area, or maybe because of pressure from supervisors, from reviewers or editors. And to solve these issues, pre-registration can be a helpful tool. But let's see what pre-registration actually means. Brian Nosek, who is an expert in open science, stated that the pre-registration of an analysis plan is committing to analytical steps without advanced knowledge of the research outcomes. The commitment is usually accomplished by posting the analysis plan to an independent registry. Pre-registration is usually done after you finish designing the study and before you start the data collection. It does not require any special permission or connection to a journal, and all current authors who are involved in the project should approve the pre-registration before submitting it. So you cannot just do it by yourself. You have to ask your co-authors, and if they approve, then you can go ahead. A pre-registration also receives a timestamp, which is usually the publication or submission date, and it also receives a DOI, making it possible to cite the pre-registration. And finally, a pre-registration is not necessarily public, but can be embargoed for up to a few years. Let's take an example of a study that compares two navigation systems to understand what exactly a pre-registration includes. First of all, a pre-registration includes a list of hypotheses or research questions. For example, navigation system A is more efficient than navigation system B. Then it also includes a plan for the sample size. For example, how many participants are you planning to recruit for your study? Which variables are you measuring? For example, the time needed to find a target using one of the two navigation systems. It's also about experimental conditions. So for example, one group uses system A and the other group uses system B. Or maybe one group uses system A first and then system B, and the other group does the same in the opposite order. It's also important to specify what are the criteria to include or exclude data. So it goes a bit into the direction of data cleaning. And finally, the analysis plan. So what kind of statistical analysis are you planning to apply to your data? There are two popular platforms that provide pre-registration. One is the Open Science Framework. The other one is called As Predicted. And in the following, I will show a couple of screenshots to demonstrate how quickly a presentation is done. And this will not be a complete pre-registration, of course, but I will just show some of the key elements. So in the first step, we need to indicate what we would like to do. So in our case, we would like to do a standard pre-registration. By the way, if you are working with qualitative data, then you can do a pre-registration as well. And there's even a special form for that, because qualitative research is quite different to quantitative research in several aspects. And there were some researchers who worked on another form for qualitative research. Then we need to fill out some metadata, which also help to create a pre-registration that follows the FAIR principles, particularly when it comes to findability. So we have to include, for example, a title, a description. We also can specify licenses. And this is all very helpful to provide rich metadata to make the pre-registration also findable at the end. We also need to specify at the beginning whether we want to generate or test hypotheses. Then we need to describe the study design. Of course, if you describe the study design, this is much more detailed than what you can see right here. So this is just an example. We also need to indicate at which stage of the research process we are at the moment. So as I said, pre-registrations are usually done after the design is done and before data collection starts. But as you can see in this list, in theory, it is even possible to pre-register a study even after data analysis. But to be honest, I'm not sure if this makes much sense, but there might be a reason for that. Finally, the analysis includes information about the methods you are planning to use to analyze your data. And that's already it. Again, this was just a quick example. A complete pre-registration should include more details. I also didn't include all the elements that are provided in the form by Open Science Framework. This was just a quick overview. And I said at the beginning that a pre-registration is quickly done. So if you have all the information at hand, then it takes not that much time. But you also shouldn't underestimate what is needed for a pre-registration, because you have to you need to create a well thought out analysis, and this also takes some time at the beginning, but it usually pays off at the end, because at some stage you have to think about the study design and the analysis. Going back to our problems. So to which problems does pre-registration contribute? First of all, hacking, so hypothesizing after results are known. Switching from explorative research to hypothesis testing is not possible anymore, since you were asked at the beginning what of the two you are actually doing. And by providing details regarding the analysis plan, you also cannot do p-hacking. And since you listed the hypothesis you want to investigate, you also cannot only report on the positive results, so selective reporting is also not possible anymore. Because reviewers can compare the final paper with the pre-registration. And if you pre-registered 5 hypotheses and you only report on the results of 3 hypotheses, then this might be a problem, unless you have a good reason not to report on the missing 2. To which problems does pre-registration not contribute? First of all, publication bias is still possible, since pre-registrations are independent of journals. You still get feedback from reviewers at the very end of the research process. There is one exception. The exception is that if you submit a pre-registration and you disseminate it on social media, then some other colleagues might see it, they can look at that, and they can also provide feedback. But I'm not sure if this happens very often. So pre-registration can help to solve quite a few issues. And we could ask the question, well, does it mean that every pre-registered study is well done? Unfortunately, this is not the case. Sanjay Srivastava asked his students to compare pre-registrations with what was reported in the final paper. And the students found quite a few discrepancies between pre-registrations and the final paper. For example, because the pre-registration only included a subset of the analysis. In some cases, important elements were missing, for example, the analysis plan. In other cases, the reported plan was just too vague, so it was not possible to evaluate the pre-registration. And although there is a form for pre-registration provided by the Open Science Framework and also by As Predicted, it does not mean that the pre-registration is complete. This shows that a pre-registered study is not necessarily well done, which is also a key limitation. One reason for that is that pre-registrations are often not peer-reviewed after they are submitted, and apparently they are not even peer-reviewed after the researcher submitted the final paper. But this is where registered reports can help. And before I continue with registered reports, Let's check again the research process. So how does it actually look like? So at the very beginning, we develop an idea or an hypothesis. Then we start designing a study to answer the research question, to test the hypothesis. And after the study design, we collect data, we analyze the data, and then we write an article about it. We submit the paper for peer review. If the peer review is successful, then the paper gets published and it can be reused by other researchers to develop new ideas, new hypotheses, new research questions. So this is, so to say, the ideal way of publishing research. I'm not sure about your experience, but in my case, it rather looked always like that. So when I submitted a paper for peer review, it usually got rejected at the beginning. And there are plenty of reasons for rejecting papers. In the best case, it's just about some clarification. So it might be that the interpretations in the paper are unclear. So you just have to go back to your article, maybe reformulate a few paragraphs, and then you can resubmit the paper. It's getting a bit more complicated if there's something wrong with the analysis. So maybe the results are not significant. Then you have to go back to the analysis stage. Maybe the reviewers are asking you to collect more data. Then you have to go back to the data collection stage, which is, by the way, also a questionable research practice. And reviewers might also complain that the study is not appropriate. And in the very worst case, they might say that the novelty of the research is unclear. Then you have basically to start from scratch. But this is where registered reports can help. What are registered reports? Registered reports are also usually done after you finish designing the study and before you started data collection. So this is the same like pre-registrations, but registered reports are submitted to a journal and they are also peer-reviewed. So typically, in contrast to pre-registrations, registered reports are not independent of a journal. If it gets accepted, it's, so to say, a guaranteed publication after acceptance, so independent of any positive or negative results. A registered report usually contains an introduction, a literature review, a method section, and an analysis plan. So this is very similar to the first sections of a normal scientific article. And it's usually somewhat of the same scientific rigor or scientific quality. And this is also different from pre-registrations where you, for example, don't need a literature review or an introduction. And registered reports, of course, change the research process dramatically. So this is how it looks like. We start again with developing an idea or an hypothesis. We design a study, and then we have a two-stage research review process. And after designing the study, we submit the registered report. And this is already peer-reviewed. So the introduction, the literature review, and the methodology, plus the analysis plan. This is reviewed at stage 1. If it gets rejected, then you either have to go back to the hypothesizing stage or to the study design stage. But you get the feedback much earlier than before. If it gets accepted, then it is called in principle acceptance. You can then go ahead with collecting data, analyzing it, submitting the paper, and then you reach stage 2. So this is the second stage of the peer review process. In this stage, the entire paper will be reviewed. The reviewers will check whether you did what you promised, and in this case, your paper will be published disregarding if you have positive or negative results. And the benefits of registered reports are quite well summarized in the following 2 quotes. One quote is by Daniel Simons, who is a professor at the University of Illinois. He said, registered reports eliminates the bias against negative results in publishing because the results are not known at the time of review. So at the time of the review at stage 1. Because the study, and Chris Chambers, professor at Cardiff University, said, because the study is accepted in advance, the incentives for authors change from producing the most beautiful story to the most accurate one. Coming back again once more to the problems we listed at the beginning. So in addition to the benefits from pre-registrations, registered reports also help to avoid publication bias, since publication does not depend on positive or negative results. And researchers receive very early feedback from reviewers. However, there are also a couple of limitations. First of all, if you are considering doing registered reports, then you should be aware that this requires a very careful time management and planning. So because you cannot start with the data collection before you get the reviews from stage 1. So you have to consider at the beginning what you are doing with the time between submitting the registered report and data collection. This can take, I don't know, it's very different, I would say. So it can take a few weeks until you get feedback, maybe even 2 months. It's I don't want to judge that, but you have to consider that, and you should know what you are doing with the time in between. Registered reports is not recommended if the data collection is about to start, because as I said, you have to plan some time to wait for the reviews. It is also not very recommended if you are under time pressure. For example, it is hardly feasible if grant deadlines are very close. Then it might also be not possible to go for registered reports. It is also difficult to combine with student projects, but this can also be solved with careful time management. An important issue is that it is still not provided by many journals or conferences. So I'm coming from the geosciences. In the geosciences, it's super uncommon to have registered reports or even pre-registrations. It's very common in psychology, for example, in medicine, biology, common compared to the geosciences. So it's not that everyone is doing that, but it's more common than, for example, in the social sciences or geosciences. And finally, it's also important that we don't underestimate the effort required to write registered reports, because a well thought out analysis plan is not that easy. I created a little table to summarize the key points and also to contrast pre-registration and registered reports. I don't want to go through that in detail. It's more like a summary, but just a few points. So the length of a pre-registration is rather flexible. In registered reports, you have to include an introduction, a related work section, and a method section. These are also usually of scientific quality, but at some point you have to write it anyway. And so it's rather moving the time for that more to the beginning. When is a peer reviewed? So pre-registrations are peer reviewed after the research is done, and registered reports are peer reviewed after before data collection. It's usually a misunderstanding that it's not possible to deviate from what you have suggested in the pre-registration or in the registered reports. So changing the study design is still possible, but you just have to provide some good reasons to do it. So if you are just changing the hypothesis and the research questions and the design plan without providing good reasons, then you will run into trouble. But if you have good reasons, because research is very dynamic and the reviewers are also aware of that, so if you have good reasons, then it's not a problem. I even heard that some reviewers are skeptical if you follow the pre-registration or registered reports 100%, because this is actually not possible. There's always something changing, and this is also considered in these two concepts. Both concepts increase transparency, help to avoid hacking, peer hacking, and selective reporting, as well as publication bias. As I said, early feedback from reviewers is actually not possible with pre-registrations unless you have some nice colleagues who look at that. But this is one of the key benefits of registered reports. This is also reflected in the number of reviews. So pre-registration, you get one, if at all. So we have seen that reviewers often do not look at pre-registrations and compare it with what was reported in the final paper, but in registered reports you definitely get 2 reviews. Registered reports are also not independent of journals, so you have to select a journal you would like to submit to at the beginning of your research. This is also one of the disadvantages, or one things that make registered reports a bit less flexible. So if you're doing pre-registration, you don't have to make this decision at the beginning. You can do it at any time, but when you're submitting registered reports, you have to do it at the beginning. Yes, so pre-registration also does not mean that you have a guaranteed publication. It just shows that you are not doing something like p-hacking or hacking, but this is the case in registered reports. And pre-registration is also not so dependent on careful time management, which is definitely the case in registered reports because of the review time in stage 2. And yeah, so pre-registration as well as registered reports can be done with an embargo. So if you fear becoming scooped because you released all the information on your data and on your analysis, you don't have to worry about that because you can simply put an embargo, and this embargo can be up to a few years. And I think that's already it. And that was the presentation on pre-registration and registered reports. Now we would have time for a couple of questions or comments. So we have a raised hand. Feel free to speak.
Well, so I'm curious from the survey right at the start, to be honest with you, because I'm a psychologist, and I think pre-registrations are not yet what I would call mainstream, but they're relatively widely known. So I was a bit surprised in this community especially that so few of us have used a pre-registration. So I'm wondering how far this is something that's known in disciplines other than maybe medicine and psychology.
That's a good question. So I can only speak from the geosciences. And in the geosciences, I think the only journal that I am aware of that at least mentions pre-registration is Nature Geosciences. And I'm not aware that any other journal is speaking about registered reports or pre-registration. I'm not sure, but we have a couple of other people in the audience from very different research disciplines. Feel free to share your experience.
Well, I can add maybe a thing. So I'm from engineering technology, and I was not aware of this pre-registration until a few weeks back, actually. So it's very uncommon in our field, and I was wondering why that is, but maybe that's also, at least if I look at my own research, a lot of my work is about generation of hypotheses, less than testing, and I guess it's a bit more difficult in this case to pre-register a study. And I'm not sure if there's any other experience, so I would like to learn.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other experiences? Yes, please.
Yes, sorry, I was fiddling with the mute button. I'm Peter de Vries. I work in psychology. I'm familiar with pre-registration. I also urge my students to use it. I don't have the impression yet that it's common practice. But what to me was new is the registered report, at least in psychology. I have heard about the Cochrane, which is a journal that operates in the medical disciplines, that had registered reports and therefore guaranteed publication after acceptance of your research plan. But I haven't encountered that yet in psychology. And there was one other thing that I was thinking. One of the downsides of, and that doesn't directly concern us as researchers, but indirectly it does, if all journals would adopt pre-registration, which would be from looking from one end, it would be very positive development, because you get rid of the file draw problem. But on the other hand, the number of publications or reports submitted for registration will increase enormously because there is no filter anymore. Now we think, and we can discuss whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but now we think, okay, there's no results. I'm not going to send in my paper. But when I have not yet collected my data yet, then any study that I do might result in might have positive results. So I might just send in every little one of my studies, and my colleagues will think the same way. So in light of the shortage of good reviewers, this is a bit of a problem. So on the journal end, so, and indirectly on our end as well, because who are the journals going to approach for review jobs? That's us.
Sorry, I only see the second names. Watson, do you want to comment on that?
It's me again. Yeah, so I think Peter raises some quite interesting points. So I mean, both Brian Nosek and Chris Chambers are psychologists. So a lot of the development in pre-registration is coming from psychology, mostly because we had a pretty bad reputation. And I don't think the problem is just in psychology. I think we've done a very good job over the last 10 years coming up with initiatives like registered reports and pre-registrations to help remedy this. But I would agree it's not yet mainstream. And just speaking to your last point about, well, if statistically significant results are no longer a filter, will we be inundated? I think that's unlikely to be a major issue of registered reports, because in many ways they're kind of an honest signal because they are very time consuming to produce. So you would only bother doing it if you were doing something that was probably sufficiently important that a null result is also really quite important. So I don't think that is likely to be a big problem, whereas I think pre-registration is alarmingly easy to game. And I think we saw in the talk that there are already people who are kind of gaming that system. But I did find it very interesting you're talking about getting your students to do it, because I also do it. And with the NWO call, one of the things I'm trying to pull together at the moment is actually an analysis of what the benefits are of pre-registration in student theses. Because I think the benefits of pre-registration can be easily overstated for we academics, because the people who do them are either gaming the system or they're good scholars who are doing everything right anyway. Whereas if a student, what I love about pre-registration is it forces you to think through the whole process, and it stops students doing that thing where, okay, they sort of pull together a rough research question and then they collect some data, then they get the data and go, what the hell am I going to do with this? And it doesn't answer their research question. And pre-registration forces them to think about that and solve that problem. So I think that's one of the best ways of using pre-registration. Anyway, I've expressed many opinions. I'll shut up now.
These were valid points. So I agree. So also as a supervisor, you know better what you have to expect from a thesis if you get something like a pre-registration. So I also supervised a couple of theses already, and we usually make some kind of a learning agreement at the beginning, or some kind of a one-pager. And this goes a bit into that direction. Raul, you want to say something?
Hi, yes, thank you, Marcus, for the presentation. I just would like to continue on the discussion on the asking students to do pre-registrations. I'm from the faculty ITC, and their students write an extensive proposal, and this proposal is defended. Well, I guess it's probably the same on campus. Can we think, or will it make sense to think of ways to extract from there a pre-registration report, or even make this a pre-registration report and explain them to the students what they are doing, or the type of commitments, ethical and scientific commitments that they are taking when they write down something in the proposal? I don't know, an open question, or
yeah, I think that would be very useful. I mean, if I look at my students, I tend to say you need to spend time thinking on the desk instead of doing stuff in the lab. And well, everybody's enthusiastic and they run in the lab and do a lot of measurements, but thinking on beforehand tends to help a lot in these cases. So forcing them to think about it this way makes sense to me. So I was also not aware that students in ITC have to prepare a sort of proposal for their master thesis, I assume then in this particular case. Yeah, that's not the case in at least not in mechanical engineering. So that's also interesting to learn.
Well, they have to write an extensive, extensive 10 pages or so proposal. They defend, then they have a midterm, and then they have the final presentation. Okay. But I think at this stage, for example, the midterm could be a moment to review things that work, things that do not work, and could maybe be more engaging for a student to also explain why certain changes had to happen, or data had to be collected, or additional data. I don't know.
Yeah, also to make them more aware of the scientific process. I mean, that would make a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Stephanie?
Hi. One thing I noticed with the pre-registration is that you can have the choice between it's exploratory study or it's a hypothesis testing study. And then you have to specify the hypothesis, blah, blah, blah. But I think one of the main problems we have in science, and the whole reason that we have this p-hacking, is that everybody's doing hypothesis testing, and usually in places where it's not even useful. And there are a lot of studies where people just are interested in, does an intervention work and how well does it work? And then they answer the question with a p-value, which is ridiculous. You want to estimate how large the effect is, for example. So I was just curious, why don't they always also change the view and not just focus on hypothesis testing, but also on quantitative questions that you might have for your data?
Watson, please go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah, but this is an excellent point, and it links very closely to the next kind of debate about, say, pre-registration that's happening in psychology, which is what it does and doesn't do. And I think a lot of people treat it as this kind of sticking plaster. It's pre-registered, so it must be a good study. Whereas you're quite right that it doesn't really tap into whether you've selected a good model or not. It doesn't tell you whether or not your theory is any good or not. So there has been a lot of discussion over the last month or two about what the next issue is going to be and how we can address that. So I think you're right, and I don't think we do have a good solution for that. But I just thought I would mention that you're not the only one thinking along these lines.
I think there's a solution, and that's what we also do in our education at BMS is where we teach students linear models, and we ask them to quantify, to interpret the results and say, okay, the something that we tried and it had this and this effect on a student, and it was with a confidence interval somewhere, and skip the whole hypothesis testing a bit. Just ask your question and answer it in the way it is appropriate. So I think the easiest solution is just to have an extra option there at the pre-registration to say I have a quantitative question.
So in that sense, a pre-registration would focus less on an analysis plan, but more on the methodological issues. So outlining what your conditions are, control conditions are, which comparisons are of interest, regardless of exactly how you analyze it, right? So it would put the emphasis more on the method section instead of the analysis section.
Yeah, method and power, I think, statistical power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Ms. Hadashik. Sorry, I don't see the first name. I tried to look it up.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, my name is Jeanette. I'm also at the Department of Psychology of Conflict, Risk and Safety, like Peter de Vries and Stephen Watson. And yeah, I'm a PhD candidate, and something that came up for me, or where I was thinking of how to solve that for pre-registration, was if I have a project where I also have students who are engaged in at least a part of my data collection. So, for example, I will have a experimental study in a lab, coming up, and I will have 3 bachelor students who are in the 3rd year who will analyze part of the data for their thesis. So they will, of course, only do a part of the analysis that I will do in the end for my PhD. But still, because I will have to give them feedback, I won't be blind to the preliminary results when I start my proper sort of more advanced analysis. And it might also be the case that for the sake of meeting their deadlines, we will have to at some point, pause the data collection, and then they will do the analysis so that they can submit their bachelor thesis. But then I might have to go on because, for example, they might do simple ANOVA, but I would like to include moderators, and I will use structured equation modeling. So I will need a bigger sample size. And I was, so all these things seem to me that, I was wondering if it's okay to just specify it like it is, to basically say, okay, this is the situation, and I might have to, depending on how many participants we get, I might have to stop or pause data collection, and then the students will do their things, and I will have to give them feedback. So I will know at least what the results of the ANOVA are going to be, and then I will carry on to do more complex analysis, but then I'm not blind anymore, so I'm already biased. So but I think for a lot of PhD candidates, we have to, sometimes it's not possible to do a bigger project without also using your supervision duties. And it also makes sense because it's very interesting for students to be involved in new research. But I was wondering, maybe somebody already has experience how to navigate that.
Yeah, Stephen, you were first.
Yeah, so I think I can help here, because one thing you have to bear in mind is so long as you stick to your original decision rule, so I will stop collecting data for you, my PhD, after this many participants, what data you have here has no impact on the data you have here. So even if your students look at it and you get significant or non-significant p-values, doesn't matter so long as you keep collecting data. So the only time you're going to have a problem is if you stop collecting here earlier than you thought, get a significant value and go, well, forget the rest then. That's when you've got a problem, and that's when you'll have bias in your statistics. So long as you stick to your original rule, there is no problem whatsoever.
Okay, yeah. So would you say as long as I meet my end goal, the end number of participants that I'm going for, it's also okay if, for the sake of the students' work, there is some sort of analysis in between? Absolutely,
because like I said, it doesn't have any impact. I mean, if you want to, of course, you can also build in other rules like sequential stopping, but that gets a bit more complicated. But I think at the minute, for you, the answer to the question is it's absolutely fine so long as you do what you promised you were going to do in the first case.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Pete, you also raised a hand, but you took it down again. Do you still want to say something?
No, I wanted to say something along the lines of Stephen's argument. So yeah, I totally agree.
I would like to bring another question in. I can see from the list that we also have a couple of professors, assistant professors, and so on. And you might be also involved in journals as editors, for example. So how can we somehow promote pre-registration or registered reports a bit more? So to make it more common. So if we see the benefits, then we might also think about ways to make it more common. Do you have any ideas how we can do that? Should we maybe set up a diamond journal, for example, and do our own stuff and include pre-registration and registered reports? Yeah, Pete.
Yeah, I'm just brainstorming here, but I think if you want to do something about it, I think for a lot of our colleagues, this may also not be on their in their field of view. So for those colleagues who have editor positions in journals, it could be just a matter of contacting them and raise this particular issue, because they are the people who can actually, if we can convince them, they can basically put this on the agenda and actually ask this of authors of submitted papers, or at least make clear that if you have pre-registered study, this is an advantage for your this gives more credence and more weight to your results. So that could be a very bottom-up way to make it more well-known and make it a well-known, put it into practice.
Mm-hmm. Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I think Peter's right. I mean, it's tricky for us unless we are in editors and journals. So I was just thinking, again, from the experience of psychology, I mean, we had some relatively high-profile academics get together and form something called the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. And this, I mean, to be honest, it's a bit culty sometimes, this group, but I think it has nonetheless been a positive force for good for the discipline. And this creates quite a significant pressure group to advertise and push out these practices. And we had a lot of luck in psychology in that the previous editor of our flagship journal, Psychological Science, also really very heavily pushed open science practices and pre-registration badges and so on. And then, of course, that trickles down. So the real question is, do people have kind of the ear of someone who's sufficiently senior that they can advertise and make required these kinds of open science practices, or at least incentivize them sufficiently? So I don't know. You need to have the power first, right?
That's certainly a good point. Any comments or questions? So I was just looking again at the results of the survey we had at the beginning, and I saw that 2 persons have already done a pre-registration or a registered report. I hope they are still there, and maybe you want to say something about it, about your experience, how it affected maybe your research process, the time that you invested. I would be very happy to hear your experiences. Yeah, Pete, you were one of them, and Stephen, okay. Pete was first.
Okay. Yeah. So I have my experience is limited to one. It was actually a replication project that I embarked upon, and for me the pre-registration was actually it was maybe an hour's work. I mean, I had the method section was already in the original paper, and I was a co-author on that, so I could use that no problem. So that was relatively easy. I did find out that in case of Open Science Foundation, maybe it doesn't go for all, but it was the case in my situation that it was reviewed. So I did get comments from someone asking for further clarification and making suggestions. But yeah, on the whole, it went rather smoothly. The only point where I myself failed was at the end. I was asked to openly publish my data, and it just hasn't materialized. Not from ill will, but because I kept postponing it until the present day, and this was a year ago or so.
May I ask if you would do it again?
Yes, I would. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really a valuable addition, and that's why I always encourage my students to do so. So yeah, I really want to make this a fixture in my work process.
And what is the main reason? So is it because you got early feedback, or what was the so to say the main incentive for you?
because I think in general it enhances the qualities of research as a whole, not just mine, but from everyone else. So, and if I'm all in favor of it, then I should engage in it myself as well. So yeah, so stripping myself of degrees of freedom, I think that's a good thing.
Thanks for sharing your experience. Stephen, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say similar. I find very few drawbacks, because like I say, even if we're not doing hypothesis testing, you can still pre-register your approach. For me, it was relatively natural because I have a background both in health research and in systematic review and meta-analysis, where registrations have been around for a very long time. So it wasn't so alien for me to start adopting this. But I would echo what Peter said. This is really relatively straightforward to incorporate into your working practice most of the time. It really doesn't take very long. And if you're just kind of dipping your toes into open science, I would say it's probably the easiest way to start. And I've encountered no downsides. One thing I would say, though, is it's been relatively common for me to end up with a different analysis than the one I pre-registered, very often on the request of reviewers. And this is very easy to accommodate. You just explain in your paper, well, we originally pre-registered this, the reviewer recommended we did this, and that's what we do. So I often have a preprint which will have the pre-registered analysis, and then the additional analysis, and then the final paper might just have what the reviewers recommended, especially if what the reviewers recommend is better, which it often is. So I don't think it necessarily inhibits your degrees of freedom that much, but what it does do is make sure you have to justify your choices. And people can very often see through a very bad justification.
Peter, I saw in the comments that you replied no, but you were also involved in pre-registering one study. Do you want to share your experience?
Yeah, sure. That was a qualitative literature review, and we used Prospero. So that wasn't mentioned yet today, and I think Prospero is also not a peer-reviewed pre-registration platform. One additional benefit of pre-registration, which I am sure was also mentioned today, is that it allows for starting researchers or people thinking about a topic to see what's already going on. So either to get inspired. So, for example, I see that research on this field is going on, but I have some room for this knowledge gap or something. But also, sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Well, I see that 5 people are doing a review on this, so maybe I shouldn't be the 6th person. Yeah, I had a bit of a idealistic view that indeed it was best practice to do, and everything was all right after you've done that and so on. So I was, I hope we did everything properly, but I was a bit disappointed to hear that, as you said in the beginning, that it's no guarantee for excellent research in the end. But I also liked that, and I think Stephen also mentioned that you have both, it forces you to think ahead, it forces you to make choices and commit. You have basically proof of your plan that you can also share afterwards, either with the editors or with reviewers and so on. Like, so this is what we did and so on. And yeah, that's, I thought it was a nice step.
Did you do it again?
And indeed, the registration itself wasn't very time consuming, assuming you've made most decisions already.
Would you do it again?
Yeah, I don't do, it's not part of my job to do a lot of studies, but definitely, yeah.
Okay. All right, so we are coming to an end, but before you leave, let me give you one final slide. First of all, I kindly ask you to fill out a quick evaluation of today's event. So I will post it into the chat. It's a quick survey, 2 questions. Please answer them to give me some insights about how you like the event or not. There's also a database of journals that provide registered reports. You might be interested in this one. There are quite a few examples in a Zotero group. with papers, including registered reports. There's also a nice YouTube video about the pre-registration of qualitative studies, if you are working with that. Finally, spread the word about the open science community. Send around emails, tell them that they can become members of our open science community. And yeah, the next Open Science Kitchen will be in 1 month, usually the last Thursday of the month. It's the 25th of March at 14 hours. And feel free to follow us on Twitter. And that's basically it. Thank you for attending.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yes, I will make the slides available.